Welcome to Keen on Keys. Today I want to show you this little analog synthesizer. The Behringer CAT, a recreation of the CAT SRM2 by Octave Electronics. I bought it for a little more than 300 euros. Yeah, I know, it's not a little toy or mini keyboard. It has no preset instruments, no rhythms, no speaker. It doesn't even have keys. But I thought I'd give it a chance. Behringer has released quite a few of these inexpensive analog synthesizers, and there are more to come. So I had to have a look at least one of them. And you know, all the mini keyboards I've shown you in my videos contain a basic synthesizer, even if the sounds are based on samples. Meow. But usually you can't change anything beyond vibrato and sustain. And I felt like trying something with a little more control over the sound. For this we have 2 VCOs and a total of 7 different waveforms which all can be mixed together. 2 envelope generators, a white noise generator, a low-pass filter with self-oscillation capability, an LFO with sine, square and sample and hold, pitch bend, glide, an octave switch and a duophonic mode. Most of the synthesizers that Behringer has released in the last years are recreations of well-known classics. A Minimoog, the Pro 1, Korg MS-20, ARP Odyssey and a few more. Octave Electronics is one of the less-known synth manufacturers of the 70s. It was founded in 1975. At a time the synth market was dominated by Moog and ARP. The first CAT model was released in late 1976, and many people think of it as a copy of the ARP Odyssey, which came out 4 years earlier. There might be some reasons for that, but this would be a story on its own. I think we could say that the CAT was inspired by the Odyssey. But there are definitely some differences in layout, function and sound that makes it a synth in its own right, which, in some points, even surpasses the Odyssey. Octave replaced the original CAT with the CAT SRM in 1977. SRM stands for Series Revision Model. It has a couple of improvements like delayed vibrato. The biggest enhancement was the 2-note memory system. This changed the behavior of the oscillators when the keys are released in poly mode. More on that later. And it was possible to order it with a couple of extra modifications like ring modulator or high-pass filter. It was more expensive than the first version, but still much cheaper than an Odyssey or Minimoog. In 1977 also the Kitten was released, a functions-reduced version with just a single VCO, another parallel to ARP and the X. The last CAT model and the one the Behringer version is based on was the SRM2, released in 1978. With additional CV and gate jacks. Finally, in 1979, Octave completed the CAT family with the CAT stick, a modulation controller with a joystick, 2 LFOs and 4 VCAs. Octave merged with Plateau Electronics, a New York synthesizer service center, and the name was changed into Octave-Plateau Electronics. The production of the CAT went on until 1981. But although it was used by a couple of famous musicians like John Lewis, Elliot Randall, Dave Fredericks, Rod Argent, David Bedford. I'm wondering if he used it on this album. Dave Greenslade, Split Ends, Devo and OMD. Octave never had the big breakthrough like ARP or Moog. They released 2 more synthesizers in 1983, the Voyetra 8 and 1, both quite innovative but without big success. And so they started to produce MIDI software and interfaces for PC, changed the name into Voyetra Technologies, and finally merged with Turtle Beach in 1996. So let's have a closer look at the new version. The build quality is nice. Metal case with wooden ends, and the knobs and sliders don't feel cheap. Behringer hasn't stick to the original layout to 100%. Of course, it's much smaller, and some additional MIDI, USB and in- and output jacks are placed on the front panel to make it Eurorack compatible. They picked up the colored sliders from the first version, which is nice. And they moved the entire envelope section to the right. This might look more familiar, however, it's not really an improvement. But there would have been room for improvement. For example, the LFO delay control. It's in a slightly wrong place on the original, due to the fact that it was added later and there was no other space left. But on the Kitten, the model with fewer functions, there was enough space to place the slider where it belongs, next to the LFO frequency control. Now it's even further away. And I think I would have placed the VCO off switch near oscillator 1. And the noise generator and sample and hold switch to the left. But it's not a big deal. The overall layout is still quite logical and easy to understand. Connect a MIDI keyboard. You can use USB or MIDI in. It only receives note on-off and pitch bend. You can't control the parameters via MIDI. Connect the high output to a line level input, or use the low output if you want to connect it to a guitar amp, for example. Let's create some basic sounds. First, we have to tune the oscillators. I start with VCO2. It has only a fine-tune control, but its range is nearly an octave. VCO1 coarse has a wide range, nearly 6 octaves up and down, while the range of fine is about 200 cents. That was sawtooth. We have 3 more waveforms on VCO1. Triangle, pulse wave, with adjustable pulse width when switched to DC. To the far left, it's square wave. Turn it to the right and the pulse gets narrower. And sub-octave. This is a square wave 1 octave lower. VCO2 has 3 waveforms: sawtooth, square wave, and sub-octave. We can blend some or all of them together to create more complex waveforms. This is a nice feature. Usually you can only get 1 waveform per oscillator at a time. And the 2 sub-octaves. That's what Octave called the fat cat. And we can add some noise. We can control the VCA with one of 2 envelopes, or transient generators as they're called here. If we bypass the envelopes, we will hear a constant sound. AR is very simple. Attack, release, and a fixed sustain level. ADSR is more flexible. The envelope is triggered every time you press a key, unless you play legato. And if you do so, you will discover that it's only possible downwards. Because in mono mode, the lower notes have priority. That means if 2 notes are held, the lower will sound. And the lower note will still sound if you release the key while still holding down the higher key. So it's a bit different from other mono modes you might know. We have a 24 dB 4-pole low-pass filter, based on the classic SSM 2044 chip, which was used in many famous synths like the Korg Mono Poly, the Poly 6, the PPG Wave 2.2 and others. We can control cutoff frequency and resonance. And of course we can add keyboard filter tracking, and ADSR modulation to make it less static. Now let's add some vibrato by modulating the frequency with the LFO. It can modulate both VCOs and the filter with sine, square or sample and hold, so it's quite flexible. For vibrato we need sine wave. The LFO delay controls the time the LFO takes to reach the maximum. Up to 5 seconds are possible, but it's only working with sine wave. We can also modulate the pulse width with sine wave or ADSR envelope. The function of the knob changes depending on the mode. In DC mode, the control knob determines the pulse width, as I've already shown you. In the other 2 modes, it's a depth control. Change the envelope for some movement. The sine mode has a fixed range in which the modulation happens. And the results are more subtle. But that's basically all we need to create some classic sounds. The pitch bender is more like an octave or manual glide switch. It snaps in at 0, but the resistance is a bit too strong to use it smoothly. I recommend to use the pitch bender of your MIDI keyboard. You can also add some glide time or combine both for a theremin-like sound. It's not possible to store any patches, and I like it to a certain extent, because it forces me to get to know the instrument very well. Once you get to that point, it should be very easy to recreate the patches. But in the beginning, it might be helpful to make some meaningful notes. Or perhaps you use some cheats like this. Or simply take a picture. Now let's have a closer look at all the other modulation possibilities. This is where things are getting interesting. The first depth knob is for LFO modulation, with 3 possibilities. I've already shown you sine wave. We can switch it to square wave for an immediate transition between 2 notes. And you can choose the interval with the depth knob. Unfortunately, the LFO delay slider has no effect in square mode. The third option is sample and hold. It's similar to square, but it generates random pitches when set to noise. But this isn't working as expected. There's some notes in between that shouldn't be there. Could be a nice effect, but makes it less predictable. We can switch it to VCO1. This also sounds random, but here we don't get these extra notes. And depending on the waveform, it's less random. The LFO can also modulate the filter. LFO cannot control the VCA, so there's no possibility to create a real tremolo effect, but we can use the filter modulation for something similar. With sine or square wave. Or we can use the ADSR Repeat. This retriggers the envelope depending on the LFO speed. In gate mode, that means as long as the key is held, or in auto mode. This function is also useful if you want to create a little sequence. The second depth knob has also three options: ADSR, AR and VCO. You can use ADSR for effects. Drum sounds, for example. Or use it for some rhythmic effects. You can also use it for a nice release effect. It brings a bit more life into a performance. AR is similar. And finally, we can use the other oscillator to modulate the frequency. I will use VCO1 to modulate VCO2. It's a bit similar to what's going on in a 2-operator FM synth, but the VCOs don't provide a sine wave, and it's not linear FM. The overall pitch changes. You can use it as an effect, or pick out a sweet spot where it's in tune. There are a couple of them. VCO1 audio signal can be switched off, and as long as one of the wave sliders is up, the frequency modulation still happens. The modulation is slightly different for each waveform, but you will have to adjust the modulation depth again. It's not the same on every key. It starts to change an octave higher and lower. VCO1 has a much wider frequency range than VCO2, so it's a bit more flexible as a modulation source. Tune it down an octave or two. And you can disconnect VCO1 from the keyboard so that it's working similar to the LFO, but much faster and with different waveforms. Octave was very proud of their 4-node sequencer patch, which uses sub-octave and pulse to create a 4-node sequence. The notes are depending on the modulation depth and the mix balance. Tempo is controlled by the frequency of VCO1. The filter can be modulated by VCO1 as well. So the frequency modulation offers another series of interesting sounds. You can also modulate VCO1 with VCO2 at the same time. That's called cross-modulation. And this opens the door for some crazy stuff. But you can also use it in a more subtle way. It's possible to play the filter just like an oscillator. Turn up Q and raise the frequency a bit. The filter starts to oscillate by itself and produces a sine wave. Now we need the right amount of keyboard filter tracking. If it's all the way to the left, the sound doesn't change. Turn it to the right until the frequency is doubled per octave. It's a bit tricky and can take a while, but it's possible. Maybe you'll have to lower Q a bit. That's good for a really low bass, for example. Add some ADSR modulation for drum and effect sounds. Add some FM. VCO2 has two sync modes to lock VCO1 to its frequency. Every time oscillator 2 has finished a cycle, oscillator 1 is reset. The basic frequency remains the same, but you can change the overtones with a frequency knob. It has no effect on VCO2. but can have a huge effect on VCO1. Add some ADSR modulation to VCO1 for the classic sync sound. And as all 4 waveforms of VCO1 have their own sync timbre, you can create many different sounds with the mix sliders. We have mode A and B. They can sound similar or very different depending on the chosen frequency. Mode A is definitely a bit dirtier. Both modes create some strange noise from time to time, especially when pulse width modulation is involved. I can't tell exactly what's going on, but my favorite is mode B. In poly mode, both oscillators also sound when you press a single key. But it also allows you to play 2 notes simultaneously, with VCO1 providing the upper note and VCO2 the lower. Both played notes are memorized independently. This was done to prevent both oscillators from playing the same note when only one of the 2 keys is released. That allows to play clean duophonic lines. But it also means that both notes are always held when only one key is released. Of course, both oscillators still use the same filter and envelope. That's called paraphonic, and it was a common design in the 70s, because it reduces the costs of a synth compared to true polyphony. The envelope is only triggered again if both keys were released before. This type of polyphony has a few drawbacks, but also the big advantage that both oscillators can be adjusted independently of each other. Because the envelope is not triggered while notes are held, you need to create some filter movement with the LFO. use the ADSR Repeat function. There's some in and outputs to connect it to other devices. Or you can use them to create some new modulation possibilities. For example, connect gate to VCO2. I like the layout and the modulation possibilities, and it's easy to understand. I'm not a big fan of the lower note priority. You have to get used to it and change your playing style a bit. I wish there was a possibility to change this. But overall, it's a good synth to start with. First, I tried to combine this review with a small general synth tutorial. Although I think most of you already know how a synthesizer works, I wasn't quite sure if this is too complex, because so far I've only talked about much simpler devices. Leave me a comment if you think I should make a little synth explanation video. But that's all for now. Thanks for watching.